At the end of the day, you try to play him in a way that gives you actions to take, and also I think a moral superiority was what I could lean on in those moments where I had to be, cruel or disrespectful or racist, basically. Yeah.
So I got to say, Manhunt is a fantastic show. I was so hooked from start to finish. And as someone who's followed you primarily through comedy throughout the years, it was so interesting to see you take on a more dramatic role with this show. What was it like when you were approached to read for the show and become part of it?
I read the book first, I think, when the offer, whatever, the invitation to participate came. And I read the book and the script. And it's such an interesting time in our history that I was more than anything excited to be a part of it. I thought it was such a great moment in history. And then, I think when I got down there with Monica, who wrote it, and Carl, the first director of the couple episodes, they were very collaborative. And I was able to, I guess I got excited about being able to research a historical character and excavate documents that have been digitized, and as opposed to creating a character from whole cloth, fictional character. And so that was really exciting too. And then as far as drama goes, yeah, I sort of prefer comedy, but this was such an interesting project and great historical moment that I really wanted to be a part of it and sort of serve the story as best I could.
Now, Monica, much like you just mentioned, talked a lot when I last interviewed her about the extensive research she did and all of the documents and stuff she was able to find. What were some of the big points that you found in regard to Samuel Mudd that really helped you embody him?
Well, one is he was an educated man. He was a doctor, and I believe he went to Georgetown Medical School. He was a country doctor, so he dealt with, poor and rich. He was a businessman. He was doing, working during the day, keeping his medical practice going and traveling about, and then, also running a farm. So he was a very busy fellow. And then I didn't have to do an accent. We talked about that, early on, because he was educated and they didn't want to get lost in the dialect world. I was happy about that because I didn't want to have to dial in a specific accent, but also he's from Maryland, and I think it's believable that he was in the, the neighboring Midwest sort of twang, which I have naturally. And then the stuff I found on the internet is just the exam of, Booth's Foot, the things he wrote about it, the federal soldiers' notes about their interviews with Mudd, in addition to the book that had other things. There's always conflicting, whenever you go into history, there's always conflicting data sets about, the bone was broken here. No, the bone was broken here, even down to medical details. So it was just interesting to see the opposing views of Mudd. And I've talked before, there was one magazine he subscribed to. It was a Christian magazine written by some monks or something, and they had changed their position on slavery early in the Civil War, and they said that Jesus would frown on slavery, so they posted their official position. And so he was indignant, as someone who benefited from slavery, who believed that the North was exploiting the South with this war, because the North made their money from steel and coal mining, and they weren't allowing the South to make their money from farming, which required, in his mind, or Southerners required having slaves and servants who would work for cheap or nothing. So he felt it was hypocritical for the North to force their economy, on the Southerners. And then the Christian magazine that had changed its position, he tried to cancel it multiple times. And it was funny because they kept sending it, and he was petty in a way that was funny, like, you better not be charging me for this because I've canceled this twice now. And the fact that exists was slightly funny. And then ultimately he wrote a tirade about their ridiculous assumption that Jesus would have frowned on slavery, because in fact, Jesus lived among slaves. He walked among in the time of slavery, and not one of his parables or stories or quotes supposedly says anything against it. So he felt religiously secure in his opinion of the superiority of, you know, the white people and also of the Southern way of life.
Very fascinating and rich history that you were able to find about him. And I'm sure that, like you said, I mean, it clearly helped you embody him well. One thing I found so interesting that Monica had mentioned was when she was looking for the person to bring Mud to life, was that she was looking for somebody who could be believable as the sort of everyman neighbor type as much as he could. Some of the darkness that he hid, you know, with the racism and with helping Booth and all of that. What was it like for you, you know, from a performance side, trying to balance those two sides of Mud throughout this production?
You do the research so you have a foundation to basically embody his point of view and see the world from that point of view. And then to actually play it and to step inside the role is a whole other thing, because that stirs up emotions, and you know, it's challenging to be inside those characters. So but at the end of the day, you try to play him in a way that gives you actions to take, and also I think a moral superiority was what I could lean on in those moments where I had to be, you know, cruel or disrespectful or racist, basically. Yeah.
I can only imagine the like you say, the emotional challenge of having to separate yourself from that role. But I'm glad you were able to find that line for yourself.
I always say comedy is more fun because drama, you're in it and then you go home and you don't feel great. And comedy, you drop it the minute they say cut. So it's harder work, but it's also beautiful to tell the story. Like, we all love Lincoln. He's like a god. God bless him and Stanton for keeping the Union intact. All of that stuff's true. And it's a wonderful treat to step inside a working farm or Confederate soldiers on horseback and hundreds of people. And it's very easy to act in those moments, you know? So it's incredible. It was an incredible opportunity to step back in time and just live and behave amongst all that.
I did actually want to touch on the costume design and the production design, because it is, like you say, I mean, it's so well done to the point that we do believe that we are in that time. How involved were you in sort of helping craft Samuel's look? Was that mostly Monica and the respective teams, or did you have some input on his whole overall look?
Well, fortunately, because he was like a Southern gentleman farmer, he got to wear like gingham and soft cotton, and everybody else in the production was wearing wool and heavy, sweaty Savannah. So it was in the world of reason that because he was a proper man, like back then they would get dressed up for dinner and lunch, they would put on a tie for lunch, etc. That was the civility of these people. So he was always sort of in that clothing, if you will, even when he was touring his farm or barking orders at people, he was sort of dressed in that gentlemanly attire. And so that was with Kathleen, the costume woman. And then it was just simple palettes, and they really didn't have a lot of outfits. So once you had like your basic look, your vest or your coat, you were going to be in that for most of the scenes, which is true to the time. They didn't have like tons of extra clothing, but they did have their good suits. So that's how Mud. And of course, he had working boots on at all times because he was in the dirt and manure doing stuff like that.
Like you mentioned with the Savannah heat, because I mean, I'm in the South myself, so I know how bad that heat can get. I'm sure it was much more comfortable to not have to film in the heavier suits like everybody else.
Yeah, those soldiers and all the people who played military folks were just completely caked in sweat. It was heavy clothing. Yeah.
I did want to touch on your work with Anthony Boyle in this show, because I mean, even though he's not with Mud long in the show, it is still a very impactful moment in both of their lives, and you two play your scenes together so well. What was it like developing a dynamic with him and shooting the scenes with him? You
know, in some ways, I mean, Anthony's such a wonderful actor, and I hadn't worked with him before, or Will, his cohort, Davey. So the beauty is you're acting with someone and you have your take on your character, and then you just let it go, and whatever they're giving you, you sort of drop all preconceptions and you go with it. So up to the moment, I know everything that happens up to the moment where Mud comes to my, or Booth comes to my farm, which is Mud knew these guys. He had come to Mud's house. Mud had helped funnel money and guns seemingly down to the Capitol in Charleston. He was up to things the whole war, even though he was in a free state and claiming to be sort of neutral in the battle, if you will. He was helping the bad guys, if you will. So, and he knew Booth and had met him at the hotels in Washington. And to that extent, they had a plan to kidnap Lincoln that Mud knew about. And so it failed because Lincoln didn't show up to the hospital. They were going to commandeer his wagon and ride him out of town and then trade Lincoln for a bunch of their favorite generals on the South, like a swap. That failed. It was towards the end of the war, so they all bailed on it. I said, you know what, the war's over. No more kidnap. Let's just ride this out. The war's almost over. These are the Southerners. And so when Booth shows up at Mud's house, Mud's playing it cool because there's people around, Lovey, who plays Mary Sims, that he doesn't really want to talk about it. And then when Booth announces, I killed him, Mud's reaction is like, you went from kidnapping to killing him? Like, he's indignant that he did that. That is a violation. Even the Southern generals at the time were kind of disgusted that a man would kill a president, even though they hated Lincoln. It was that gentlemanly thing of like, you don't do that. That's not how a war is fought. You get two sides with guns and you battle that way. It was dirty, you know? So Mud was shocked that he had killed the president, and he also had to keep it under wraps because he knew what was coming. He knew that they would be looking for him. He knew that he was incriminated the minute Booth showed up. So there was all that subtext. But at the end of the day, once Anthony, who's completely committing to Booth and being a wild egomaniac, basically like Booth was and will, I'm taking that in and just and enjoying it and riding with it.
Anthony truly just captures Booth's manic energy so well.
Yeah.
And you play off of it very well in the scenes you have together. One thing I do love about this show too is much like a lot of the show, it explores an underexplored part, which is the actual trial of the conspirators. And the atmosphere of those scenes is just so heavy, not only because it is, like we said, you know, that Southern heat clearly coming into that room, but everybody's emotions that are fully charged. What was it like for you filming those days, especially since Mud is practically just sitting there having to quietly listen to everybody talk?
I think Mud felt he was being railroaded because he didn't perhaps know about this assassination attempt. You know, he knew he did lie to the federal soldiers, though. He was in fact an associate of Booth's, and he did know completely who that was, and he should have reported it, et cetera, et cetera. He was complicit in many ways. So I think his indignant was like, I'm not of the same cloth as these people you're associating with. And he also was playing for his life because he knew he was going to get hung. And so he was pulling strings, intimidating, you know, he was doing anything he could to spare his life. So to that end, I think the stakes were really high. And I think Mud had an opinion of his separateness from these other culprits. So I had a lot to like sort of play and watch, but you're right. It was, you know, everything felt torchlit and in fact was at times. And, you know, there was the first woman to be hanged, I think, by the federal government, Mary Surratt. And it was the first trial where I believe slaves were allowed to testify, or one of the very few ones. So it was really unprecedented what was happening. And obviously mixed in with the soup of the war had just ended. Lincoln had just started his second term. You know, it was so much going on.
It's amazing how many layers there are to that whole chapter of American history. And I love that this show tries to unpack some of them. What is one of the big takeaways that you're hoping audiences are getting from this show? Whether it be, like I said, you know, learning about this chapter or learning about certain people involved in this whole thing.
As a piece of history, it's so helpful to understand how close and how lucky we got that it, you know, if Mud had gotten further into the South after he took the president's life, who knows what, even though the generals had surrendered, who knows if that would have re-energized the South and dragged the war on longer. Like, and also the I think oftentimes the actions of a few good people can have an impact. So obviously, Stanton, stepping in the wake before the next president is sworn in and navigating the capture of Booth and having a peaceful transition of power was a very integral part to the continuation of the democracy. So I guess it's neat to see those heroes painted and their stories brought to light. Basically, unknown people can do great things, because I don't think anybody knew about Stanton or some of these characters.
I know I personally didn't. And I know a few history buffs who, even when I was telling them about the show, were like, huh, I didn't know that was such a big thing. So I'm like, yes, go watch this show. Go learn more. This show has a lot to tell. Oh, sorry, go right ahead.
I'll just say, I think a lot of history evolves too. Like, we have a better understanding of things as more documents come out and as more experts, prove out. There are certain first takes of any historical event, but as time passes, I think we have a more nuanced and detailed understanding of any given historical event.
There may be more layers to learn in the future, so who knows? But I hope people dive into it. Before I let you go, I had a couple of questions aside from the show. I mentioned I love your comedy work, and Elias in Ghosts has been such a joy throughout the show. I love that it remains just as popular as ever, and that they're working on a 4th season. I'm curious, have you heard any rumblings or have any thoughts about possibly coming back even after what happened at the end of the last Halloween?
No, I knock on wood. I love doing that show. They're so funny there, and the writers and cast are amazing. They tried to bring me back for season 3, but it couldn't work out schedule-wise because I was doing something and they only had 10 episodes because of the strike. So they had a short season. So God willing, I will fly my butt back up to Montreal to step into Elias, because it's a fun character and I love that. Yeah, I love doing that character. It's really fun. So I think I'll probably do something in season 4.
I love to hear it, because if you were on the books for 3 and couldn't make it happen, then you better be on the books for 4. I want to see him back. And my very final question: about a year ago, you had mentioned that you hadn't heard any updates about a possible Veep revival, but that you had heard that there was always talks of some kind of movie. And
wait, hold on. Did I tell you this, or did you read this?
I read this elsewhere. I wish it had been to me, but no. Okay, I remember this came up in an interview. So I just was curious if there had been, it's a year later, a lot of things have changed. Has there been any further rumblings or further ideations of a possible continuation?
Oh my gosh, it's such a big undertaking to get all of us together. Obviously, if Julia's in, we're all in. So, but I have not heard any rumblings other than it's a huge undertaking to gather people and do a movie. So there was talk of that right when the show ended, like maybe we'll do a movie, like in the best way, because we loved each other and we wanted to find a way to work together. But as time goes, I have no updates. And I also know that like a simpler version, like a podcast, we could probably read old scripts or something. So, but there's no updates. That's the hot take.
Hey, rewatch podcasts and such are quite the trend nowadays. So that might be the way to sort of drum up new interest.
That's what Tim Simons and I do, a Veep rewatch podcast. So.
Oh, well, I can't believe that. I missed that on my radar. I'm going to have to look into that now. But
it's second in command. Yeah, it's second in command. And all the gang comes through. Everybody comes through. Julia, Tony, Sam, Anna, Kevin Dunn, Gary Cole. We've had everyone.
That's awesome. Well, then I'm definitely going to get on that as soon as I can get through all of my interviews that I have this week. And I look forward to hopefully talking with you again, Matt, in the future. I love the show. I love the work you did on it. And whether it's drama or comedy, I look forward to seeing what you got coming up.